Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Growing Generations podcast. This is episode number 8. And so, with this is like we have on this podcast show about like a month or two going around there. But we have a new guest with us this week, Scott Head from Black Gumbo Southern Gardening. He is another well-known Southern gardener, and he's another great gardener to look at if you are a grow your own food gardener. He has very useful tips and advice when it comes to many topics of growing veggies, fruits, etc. And so I decided to bring him along to this week's episode because this week's episode topic is tips and tricks on growing tomatoes. Tomatoes is a constant rising plant in the garden industry because of everybody likes tomatoes, everybody likes growing tomatoes, everybody likes eating tomatoes, especially with the hundreds of varieties that are out there. There is constant videos out there showcasing each and every single one of them. So, we're going to go ahead and discuss a few things about them, like best ways to grow them, the best how to get bigger harvests, etc. So, let's go ahead and bring in Scott from the Black Gumbo Southern Gardening. Hi, Scott. How's everything going over there?
Things are going well. I can't complain. How are you?
I am good. Over here in Southern Florida, we are getting hotter and hotter by the day.
Well,
Um,
we've already got our tomatoes out in the garden, so
yeah. And so we're going to discuss all about tomatoes, especially since when overviewing your channel and your posts, I see that tomatoes is a constant thing I see on your channel. And it's something that lots of people love, especially with the hundreds and thousands of varieties of tomatoes out there, from cherry, indeterminate, determinate. There's so many varieties out there from everybody to choose from. And so we're going to go ahead and start off this episode with the question I always ask every guest we have. How did you start gardening?
how did I start gardening? Well, I started gardening when I was a little kid. My dad gave me a 2 foot by 3 foot piece of hard clay on the side of the house in the shade, and let me plant some seeds there. So that kind of got me started. When I had my own property, it wasn't long before I started gardening. Um, it's been about 20 years that I've been a gardener for real. And in fact, just this spring, it's the 10th year anniversary of my current garden in its form it is now. So, what got me into it? I don't know. I just liked the idea of seeing life come from the soil, seeds come into fruition. It's just fascinating to me. It's also, once you have gardened, you have a sense of accomplishment that I don't know that you get in many other ways. I really enjoy the sense of accomplishment, and when you're enjoying your own food, it's awesome.
Yes, I definitely have to agree with that as well because something that brought me into gardening, let alone, is seeing how a full, mature, developed plant could come from a very tiny seed.
Hmm.
Now, I know seed starting is something that a lot of us gardeners do because it's an affordable way to do it. And so I feel like there is more opportunities with seed starting because you're able to select the varieties you desire, etc., and it's more affordable in general. And so when it comes to tomatoes, I know a lot of people start them by seed because, in my opinion, they're one of the most easier ones to start from seed. But I have seen some cases in which some people actually buy starts from the big box stores or from their local nurseries. If you had to like balance them or say which one is better, the seed starting, or would you prefer getting them already grown from your like local nursery or big box store?
Well, I actually do both because I can't resist it when I'm at the store and I go buy the plant and say, I just can't resist seeing the tomato plants there. And there are usually common varieties that grow around here quite well. Most of our stores around here are pretty good about that. But there's my seed starting station right there. And I like to start seeds because of all the different varieties you can get. And it gives me an early start. Um, not everybody has a seed starting station though, but over the years you can gradually work up to it. and get some lights and get a heat mat. But you don't even need all that to start your own seeds. You can start them outdoors directly. You can start them in a window. But I like to start the seeds for the varieties. There's so many varieties you can get of my two favorite things to grow are tomatoes and peppers, and I'm always trying new varieties. So this year I started in January to be able to pot up at the beginning of February, and then to be able to get them out right about now. So that's that's my favorite thing to do. And it's so again, it's one of those rewarding things when you sow seeds and you actually see them break the surface of the soil for the first time. It never grows old. So,
Yes, definitely have to agree with that. I'm in the same position as well. I do both because something lots of people know is that I'm not the best at seed starting because I don't have a seed starting station, and I tend to be a little bit impatient at times. And so when it comes to tomatoes and stuff like that, I have grown some from seed, like the green zebra I started from seed. Those were planted by seed and they're growing right now. But other ones like Roma and Sweet Hundreds, those I got from starts from my local nursery. And I'm in the same position because I feel like if you want to get a jump start and your nurseries are already putting out tomato starts, it does not kill to get one or two to have an early jump to it. But if you want your more like uncommon varieties that you know you won't see pop up at your local nursery,
hmm
that's when I feel like you would get your seed varieties and start them because I feel like tomatoes are very easy. Like compared to any other seed I've grown, tomatoes have to be one of my favorites because they germinate within the same week you plant them.
hmm
They grow really quickly and they don't waste no time in spitting out flowers. I know
right.
that there's some tips which we'll get to that in a little bit, but I know that there's a whole process you could go through and so many different methods of growing tomatoes because I
hmm
know like there's the Florida weave method, there's just so many out there. All right, so I hear Jay, our moderator, has a question. Scott, were you affected by the pepper gate when professional growers mislabeled hundreds of thousands of peppers?
Um, I guess not because I haven't even heard of it. I've been kind of unplugged. Maybe maybe you know that my YouTube channel was kind of dormant for a little while.
Hmm.
I've been unplugged from gardening community for a bit. I'm getting back into it now, but this spring. But so I didn't pay much attention to a lot of what was going on in the gardening community. So I don't know, Jay.
I haven't even heard of that issue actually happen. Is there other gardeners, Jay, that you know that have been affected by that? I've never heard of the pepper
I
gate.
guess I'll find out. I've got about 8 varieties of peppers growing, and if they're not what they're supposed to be, then
Then
I'll let you
yes. All right. So I'm actually gonna go ahead and get ready to start some of my tomato seeds, probably some of my most early producing ones because the heat is already cranking up here in
know.
Florida. And tomatoes are not the best performers with our heat and humidity. They tend to suffer on the little bit of side. However, I realize that if I plant them in a little bit of a shady area or a little bit more of a cooler area during our hot temperatures, they will do some pretty well. Of course, they're not going to perform as best because here in Florida, our best growing season is in the winter, fall or
hmm
winter. That's where we sprout. That's where we have our main abundance because of the cooler weather, less humidity, etc. However, it's not totally impossible to grow during the summer. It's just going to be a little bit more harder and time consuming because of the heat and humidity that's present. So, when it comes to seed starting tomatoes, I know that although they are one of the easiest seeds to start, there is some issues some beginner gardeners or gardeners in general tend to see. For example, some gardeners deal with damping off. Some people see early signs of like blight. Some people get early disease with their seedlings. Some people get leggy tomatoes. There is many things that may occur when you start seeds or tomatoes from seed. And so is there any tips that you could have on the best way to have the best quality tomato seedlings or how to have them the healthiest until they get transplanted out into the garden?
Yeah, I think starting off clean with disinfected seed starting cells and fresh seed starting mix helps avoid things like damping off, or that's a fungal thing. and the cleanliness, a bunch of different. I don't see that as a problem with tomatoes because you can just plant them deeper. But legginess usually comes because they're reaching for light. Is that's the what most people say. There's not enough light, so they're struggling to get closer to your light source. So when you do have seeds and you do have a light source, get it up as close as you can to the light source. Or if it's a windowsill, rotate your tray around every now and then, because those seedlings will start to lean. And but again, that I don't see any of that as any trouble because when you plant them out, just stick them in deep, up the stem. And let's see what other another key is to keep them well watered. Not mushy, but keep the soil moist and stay on top of that. Because if you have certain kinds of lights, like the T5 bulbs, I used to have T5 fluorescent bulbs, they put off heat. And that was good. The heat helped the seeds to germinate, but also caused the soil to go dry pretty quick. And you'd come in and your seedlings would look like they're wilting and you freak out. Now, the good thing is tomatoes want to grow. You just water them and they'll perk up again. They're pretty tough plants. But yeah, I'm trying to think. I took some notes here, but again, if you can work up to the point where you have lights and a heat mat and somewhere to keep it, that's it's almost impossible to fail. Um, when you plant your seeds, be mindful of the temperatures. If you don't have a heat mat, tomato seeds want to germinate around 70 to 80, maybe 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and you can get them to come up even if you don't have a heat source, if the ambient temperature is just about 70 to 85 degrees. And I mean, my house kind of stays that temperature indoors, So, what part of Florida are you in?
I'm in southern Florida, so we're more
Okay.
towards like Fort Lauderdale, the Broward County area.
So, you have a little bit more, we're probably similar in terms of weather.
Yeah.
If you start seeds outside, we could probably have done that already.
Yeah, we started that quite a long time ago. Where are you in Florida or are you in a
No,
different
I'm in
state?
Houston, the Houston area.
Oh yeah,
But
we kind of have a little bit of similar temperatures as well.
I just got moved to Zone 9B. So,
Oh yeah, I'm
we were
about a zone higher than you. I'm zone 10B.
okay. Yeah. Um, yeah. Sowing tomato seeds is, it's not that difficult, but if you do have those kinds of problems, if you people who have the problems with the tomatoes are usually not enough light or unclean seed starting conditions. You know.
Yes. And so that's something I definitely have to agree on because something when it comes to tomatoes, like you've mentioned before, there's barely like you're not gonna fail. There's probabilities that you will have 100% success because they're super easy. I even seen like my neighbor who is another gardener. She's more of a I'm gonna throw it in the garden and see if it works. She's not really about the let me go ahead and hardy them off first, start them indoors and out. No, she doesn't do all that. What she did is she would get like cut up peppers or anything
Mhm.
like that. And she would just throw it in the garden. She would just throw it. And she would have successful plants. Like there's this one time she threw habanero pepper seeds in the garden. She just threw them and they came up so pretty. Hundreds of peppers and not one disease in sight. I was like, all right. And so tomatoes are easy. I've seen people cut up tomatoes in slices, planting them out in the garden. Tomatoes were easy in general. There is other varieties out there that I've probably realized because I've grown like Roma, which is something we use a lot, Sweet 100, and I grew green zebra. But I know that sometimes some tomato varieties may be a little bit more picky. I don't know if that makes sense because
Mhm.
with my green zebra tomatoes compared to my Roma tomatoes, my Romas grew so well. They started off, but then the green zebras took their time. They
Mhm.
slow growing. They're just starting to push out fruit, and I think I planted them towards the endings of December, around the month of December, I planted them out and they're just starting to push out fruit while the Romas have been produced and they are gone now
Mhm.
because I replaced them with something new. And so I feel like the varieties differ of the growth habit of each, because not all are going to be like these huge tree type plants, which we'll get to right in a little bit. So when it comes to tomato varieties, we know that there is hundreds, if not thousands, of varieties out there for you to choose from. There's even like white tomatoes I've
Hmm.
seen. And so, what are your like top 5 or 10 varieties you tend to lean towards more? Which ones are you trying out new that you would like to try out, and which ones are you like trying to like you probably would not grow again?
All right. You'd mentioned also that certain varieties grow different ways than others, and I've found that many of the Russian varieties, like the black Russian and the purple
Mhm.
Russians and the black Krim, um, the black Krim is from Crimea area. These don't do well for me. They prefer a more moderate temperature. They prefer a more cooler climate. So I tried to grow those. In fact, my first single seed challenge was a Black Beauty and it was had its origins in Russia, and it grew, but it didn't put on much fruit. And when it finally did, the fruit didn't have time to ripen. It was too
Mm.
hot. So I've written those off. Those are the varieties I don't pursue as the ones that kind of when you're looking for seeds, oftentimes you can see when you're shopping a catalog or looking online, you can see where the variety originates, and be wary of something that comes from a climate that's radically different than yours. But then there's others that it doesn't matter; they just grow like crazy. So my favorite varieties are the plain old Cherokee Purple. I like that. I tend to grow it every year. In fact, that's one of the ones I bought from my local nursery. Is an already two of those Cherokee Purples. I like that. I like the Amana Orange, which is a huge, big orange gold tomato that comes from the Amish country. I like the Amish paste tomato because I had some from a friend and I never grew it until this year, but I like the tomato, so I'm going to grow that. There's one called Edox. It's a hybrid, but it's a cherry tomato, and that's my all-time favorite. And the only place you can get that is Johnny's Seeds because they're the ones who breed the varieties that produce that. It's a really productive cherry tomato that produced for me throughout the summer, while the others shut down. These guys just kept going. They're typically a greenhouse tomato, and I didn't expect them to do well here in the heat, but they did just fine. So now I grow them every year, and I grow them a particular way of trellising. And let's see, I'm trying to think of others I like. I've grown so many varieties that I can't remember them all. I'd have to go back and watch my taste testing videos, but most garden grown tomatoes are going to be better than store bought, and so I'm really
Mhm.
not usually disappointed. I was disappointed with a little cherry tomato called Juliet because its skin was so thick that I won't grow that one again. So that's one that it tasted fine, but I mean the skin was like leather. So
Oh wow. Oh.
I mean it was rough. It was like plastic, but the thing grew and grew and grew all through the winter. But unfortunately, it was more for compost.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely have to agree with you, because something that I've noticed in my garden is I have the best success with cherry tomatoes. Cherry tomatoes are by far my favorite tomatoes because they just keep growing and they keep producing, especially the it was not yellow pear. It was this other one. It was like a yellow cherry tomato, like it didn't have that pear shape, so I know it wasn't yellow pear. Probably it was. I don't know, but it was a sweet 100. I know grew sweet 100. Those are prolific in my area. Everglades tomatoes, hence the name Everglades, perfect in my area as well. And then that one yellow cherry tomato. I don't remember or recall the name because that one I did buy off of a big box store. I have to go through and see in one of
Mm.
my videos which one was it. And those produced like crazy. Those just were on a constant roll. Those did not stop. If I harvested the entire or cleaned the entire plant, the next day I would have to clean the entire plant because they were constantly producing, which I find always really cool. One that I tried growing was this one from Baker Creek. I don't know if it was like Lola Risa, something like that. It was a purple and yellow tomato. So it had like a purple top and then a yellow base.
Hmm.
And so I tried growing that one, and that one wasn't successful. I tried the seeds over and over again, and they didn't grow for me. And so those I've never grown again. I wanted to grow them again, but they didn't really do the best for me. Another one was from Burpee Gardening, which was Italian Ice. That one was a almost like a very light cream color, but I considered it white
Hmm.
tomatoes. Now, being completely honest with you, would I have tried them? Probably not. Because the white tomato, like my mom, is a huge tomato fan. She eats any tomato. But when I told her I'm trying to grow a white tomato, she was like, you know. And so she just sticks to the basics, which my basics has to be the Sweet 100 and aromas. Those I have to have in my garden every year because they're prolific performers in general.
Now you mentioned the cherry tomato that was purple on top and yellow on the bottom,
It was
right?
a regular, it was an indeterminate variety. It wasn't a cherry, but it was a regular tomato. It
Oh,
was,
okay.
let me see if I
Because I
probably
just
might search.
found a cherry tomato at my local grocery store that was actually really delicious. Um, I bought them and I thought, man, this is so good. I'm going to save seeds and see if I can grow them. The risk in that is number one, it's a hybrid, so I might get genetic
Oh,
regression. I don't know if it's hybrid. I assume it is because it's the store. But it doesn't hurt to try. And number two, I noticed that it's a product of Canada, so they've been greenhouse grown in a radically different environment. So you
oh.
get them to grow. They're so delicious.
All right, so I found it. So the one I tried was called Sarolosi. I'm gonna type it out. It's a weird name. This one is it. That's the spelling.
Wow,
That one was
interesting,
from Baker Creek.
awesome.
They sent that one out for me to try, and it's so cool. It looks really, really cool. And so I tried growing it. Wasn't the it wasn't a success, but I'm not gonna knock it out completely. I'll try to grow it again. But one that I wanted to grow was a green zebras. They're producing right now, but the plant is starting to suffer. I think it might has early signs of blight or something's going on that I have to go ahead and investigate because the plant doesn't look regular and the fruit is doesn't look 100% normal. So I'll have to go through and research what's going on there. All right, so moving on is now that you start your tomatoes from seed and they're growing on and now they're ready to be transplanted out into the garden. Now, there's many ways you could grow tomatoes in the ground or in the container. I've grown them both ways. However, in your journey or your gardening journey, what would you feel is best, growing them in the ground or growing them in containers?
Um, well, I do both because it gives me more room and more varieties. Um, I find that the tomatoes I grow in the ground do far better than tomatoes grown in a container. Simply, just like any other plant, it's got limited resources, and it's dependent on you to fertilize the soil in
Mhm.
the pot more frequently than you probably have to in the ground. Because when they're in the ground, those roots they sprawl and they can go and um, you know resource their own uh, fertilizers and nutrition. So I actually do prefer the ground. Um, or when I say the ground, I mean my raised bed, but it basically has become one with the natural ground. It's just been amended now. But yeah, I prefer the ground because I tend to. It's not as hard to stay on top of watering and all that. If you've got a bunch of containers, that's great. But you have to go and get out there in the heat and work on them and water them and make sure they're doing okay. But like I said, I do both because I'm kind of greedy with tomatoes, and the more I can plant, the better.
Yes, I definitely have to agree. And keep in mind that it doesn't take much for you to have a lot of tomatoes.
Right.
I with the two plants, I was giving them away left and right. I just was tired of tomatoes by the end of that season. I have to agree in the same way because with me, on the other hand, I know any plant grown in the ground is gonna do way better in the ground because containers are more limited space. They don't have as much access to natural nutrition that you may supply because in the garden you'll see like constant earthworms, etc., natural composition. If you see like or compost with natural things that decompose in general. But with me, I grew them in a Smart Pots purple big raised bed. I grew both of them in there. And something I like about these raised beds or containers is that they don't limit the roots. So something I
Right.
realized is that the roots ended up growing out of the cloth pot raised bed and into the ground.
Hmm.
So in general, I grew them in the raised bed and they performed so great. And then when I was lifting it up, I noticed that the roots were also reaching to the ground. So not only was it getting supplemental nutrients from what I was giving it, but it was also getting whatever was underneath it, which was like the dead grass, earthworms, and everything. Because whenever it rains here, like the other day, we had a huge storm come through Florida, and we had earthworms everywhere in the patio, on the back porch, everywhere. And so tomatoes tend to do really well. Um, of course, here in Florida, it's like I've mentioned before, it's only best during the winter seasons. When you grow summer seasons, you're looking more towards cherry varieties because those are able to sustain the heat a little bit better.
Hmm.
And they are a little bit less maintenance than the regular big beef type ones. I think the big beef type ones you would have to really invest your time into, because I've seen people literally have competitions over tomatoes.
Right.
Have these big pound things. And so like they do everything to get that tomato to that size. And I know one of the things that they do is they pinch off lots of fruit, they go through, they thin off lots of fruit, and they make sure that the plant isn't starting flowers early. Now with me, if it's like a cherry variety, I don't pinch off the flowers. I left them do their thing and then they grow and they do whatever. Now, in your perspective, when it comes to like pinching off the flowers, if they're producing early or thinning out fruit, what's your point of view on that? Because I only do it with my bigger varieties of tomatoes, but I don't do it with my cherry ones.
I never do any of that because I figure the plant's gonna, if it's not going to produce on early flowers, it'll drop the blossoms itself at some point. Um, because I'm just waiting for the temperatures to be right because
Mhm.
a tomato blossom only has viable pollen between like 70 degrees and 85 to 90 degrees. Most varieties, not all of them. Like the Everglades you mentioned, that'll grow anytime, anywhere. Um, I mean, that would grow in a volcano. But I mean, you got to. I don't bother with any of that. Now, if I was really trying to get some big giant, beefsteak tomatoes, maybe I would look into it. But usually, the kind I grow are not that big. So I just and also it depends on the growth habit you're going after. If you're going for a single vine or a couple of vines, or if you're letting them sprawl, that would also uh, have a impact on what you do to pinch bud. What you're saying, pull the flowers off. I
Pinch
I
them
don't I
off.
don't mess with it.
Yeah, I definitely have to see eye to eye on that because I feel like the tomato, it's a tomato. It's gonna do perfectly fine. And if it does not gonna produce on that flower, it's gonna drop it. Like when I did like a little comparison on pinching off the flowers and leaving them on, I noticed that pinching them or not, there's barely any difference because when it comes to that, the I pinched them off, but then on the plant I left them on, they dropped those flowers almost immediately after they opened. If not a few weeks later, they started producing. The same goes with the other one. And so I feel like if you really want to have a stabilized root system or a constant plant structure that's healthier, then yeah, but I feel like with tomatoes, there's no need to do that. I only see you doing that for like other things, but not even because I feel like that's just a little, you
Yeah,
know.
it's well, I do prune my tomato plants to keep them from getting dense because the
Mhm.
danger here in this humid environment here on the coast is they can get fungal diseases and all kinds of problems with tomatoes if they stay uh, if they don't have good airflow. And so I like to thin them out and keep them from touching the ground. Um, but then again, some varieties you can just let them go, let them sprawl. I grew my edox last year. I just let them sprawl, and they were in a weedy bed full of weeds and competition, but they still did great. But that's an exception. It's a cherry tomato, and they're pretty tough. I tried to grow Everglades, but I couldn't get my seeds to start. They were seeds that I swiped when I was visiting Florida one time.
Oh.
David the Good, if you know him as a gardener, he gave me some of them. I ate most of them, but then the seeds I tried to keep, I couldn't get them going. But I really want to grow that one. It's like candy. They're so good.
Yeah, I actually met David the Good, and he gave me true yams and a blue Java banana. They're doing really well right now, but Everglades tomatoes I don't even need, because at my nursery in Parkland, we planted Everglades tomatoes like about a year ago,
Hmm.
and without us planting them, they sprouted out of nowhere. I don't know if the seeds just did not germinate during the heat or something, but they all you just started seeing Everglades tomatoes popping up everywhere. And so Everglades tomatoes is almost considered a weed to me, because you'll see them growing everywhere. We actually
Mm.
started selling them at the nursery and we sold them off, but they kept growing. So Everglades tomatoes, like you said, they could even grow in a volcano if they wanted to,
Yeah.
because they are very easy to grow. But for seed wise, maybe because Everglades tomatoes are super easy. I don't know if it
Who
was
knows?
weird. It's weird. Sometimes the seeds are not viable.
Right.
Who knows? It's totally something that we did was we just left the fruit there naturally, like comp decomposed, and the
Hmm.
seeds just germinated as
Yeah.
is, and so those grow really well. We grew a purple variety, we grew green zebra, and we grew a regular red variety. Of course, the regular red variety did perfect. Green zebra was the last that we harvested. Those are just starting to produce for us. They're just a slower grower, but the purple varieties have produced the same as the red ones, which were really really good. So when it comes to overall tips on growing tomatoes, overall tips like sunlight, water, soil type, things like that. What are your overall tips on growing tomatoes?
My first and most important tip is to buy this book. Not my book, I didn't write it, but Epic Tomatoes by Craig LaHoulier. This man is like the tomato guru. And in that, it gives you step by step from every step of the way. And it's a wonderful book. And so most of my advice that I've learned over the years comes from that guy and his YouTube channel. I don't think he posts on his YouTube channel much anymore, but um, the best advice, I guess, is just do it. Like you said, I have a neighbor who just goes to the store and buys a tomato plant and hardly cares for it at all. They just throw it out in the backyard and they have tomatoes.
Mm-hmm.
So just do it is the first advice. Just go for it and don't worry about it too much. Learn as you go. Um, I encourage regular fertilizing with a liquid fish type fertilizer and a liquid fish based fertilizer that has also kelp. There's one I use called Neptune's Harvest, and tomato plants don't need as much nitrogen as they need the phosphorus and the potassium. So I, um, I like to use a low dose of that once a week as I'm watering on my outdoor plants, especially if they're in containers. And it might sound like too much, but it's just a low dose. And the fish fertilizer is it stinks, but it's good for the plants. Also, if you're going to grow tomatoes in a garden, don't space them too close because they're little when you put them in the ground, but they're going to grow huge. Um, Most people plant too close together. A minimum for me is 3 feet, and that looks like a lot of space that you're wasting. But your tomatoes will be a jungle in a couple of months. So it really depends on how you're going to train them to grow. If you're gonna train them up a vertical trellis, then you don't have to put them as far apart. If you're gonna have them in tomato cages, like if you got some determinate varieties and you're just gonna cage them, they don't have to be that far apart. But the further apart they are, the better they'll withstand seasons of drought because they're spread out. Their roots are out there foraging for resources, and they're not competing with one another as much. Um, Prune them if you want to, and if you're going to prune, don't be afraid to learn how and watch some videos or read a book and figure out how to prune them, because you can prune your tomatoes, but you don't have to. It's kind of a gardener's myth that we have to pinch suckers
Mhm.
and prune our tomato plants. You can let them grow. You can let them sprawl and grow the natural way. And there's more risk in that in terms of getting diseases because they'll be laying on the ground. Um, but you don't have to. If you forget to get out there and trellis and train your tomatoes, don't worry about it. So um, and then don't overwater, because when you overwater, then all of a sudden your leaves are changing colors and you're freaking out trying to figure out what's wrong with my plant. Another important thing with tomatoes that are outdoors is to inspect them regularly. Go walk among your plants every day, because if you get a hornworm, he can destroy a plant overnight.
Mhm.
And like I got army worms in one of my plants last year, and they were on one plant, but they devastated the whole plant. That's how I saw them, as I looked out there, and there's a gap. It's like, where's my tomato plant? And they had army worms. And these kinds of things are you're going to have pests and you're going to have challenges like that. You're going to have diseases sometimes. You're going to get blossom end rot. Um, it just happens, and you just deal with it. Once you get army worms, for example, you just spray them with BT and they're gone. So uh, I'm trying to think. I had some advice written down here, and I'm trying to see. I think I've gone through all of it here. Other than, and we've already talked about most of the other stuff, like be mindful of temperatures when you're,
Yeah.
don't expect your tomatoes to produce fruit when it's 110 degrees outside and on every single day, like it was this past summer.
Yeah.
Uh, I do see people buying tomatoes from the Home Depot far too late in the season.
Yeah.
They're buying tomatoes in here. If you're buying tomatoes in May, you're not going to get much fruit off of them, because by June it's already going to be too hot. So be
I think
mindful.
timing is really important as well.
Hmm. Yeah, and that there, Jay just linked to one of my videos. I guess
Yes.
everything you need to know.
Yes.
Watch that video.
Yes, that is like the guide you need to read to look up onto. And once again, a huge shout out to Jay because Jay has been putting out videos that you have from like the how to trellis tomatoes, how to make a single vine tomato, which tomatoes best, your tomato test. You have an entire selection of tomato videos from Scott Head right there in the comment section.
I, well, I do like growing them, so I like
Yes, I
eating
am
them
gonna
too.
get ready to actually do some seed starting today. Like I just want to get a little handful in, because like we're getting hotter, it gets pretty quickly hot, especially since here in like Florida, once the humidity hits, it could say it's like 70 something outside, but the humidity is gonna make it feel like 80 something.
Yeah,
So that's the issue I'm dealing with. And so like I'm converting the garden into agroforestry. I feel like popping in a few tomatoes here and there won't hurt. It'll fill in some
right.
gaps that I have. So yeah, moving on to our next question is how to overall achieve bigger harvests. Because I know some people are like, oh my god, like pinch off some fruit, get some juicier fruit. Some others like, no, stay it for more quantity other than quality. And so, how can you achieve overall a better harvest from your tomatoes?
Um, there's kind of a balance, because if you're going to start pinching off and doing things like that, it's my belief that you're not really going to improve your harvest that much. The way I would get more tomatoes out of a plant is with regular fertilization. I find that gives me much better harvests and more tomatoes. Um, Also, selecting varieties that perform well in your area. Um, but if you do want to give it a shot, then prune your plant to a couple of two or three main vines instead of just one, and or let it sprawl. The thing, if you let a tomato plant sprawl, even though they're indeterminates, and even though, or well, it's the same with indeterminates. They've only got a lifespan that's so long. They only have enough uh, genetic makeup to produce a crop of a certain size each season. Now that you can treat them as perennials, they can, if you keep them alive, they'll put on another crop. But each year, they tend to only put on a certain amount, even the indeterminates. So it's like when you're pinching pepper plants. Like if you pinch the top of a young pepper plant off, it will branch out more. You'll get the same amount of pepper fruit in terms of weight, but the peppers will be more abundant. They'll be smaller but more abundant. I'm not sure if that goes with tomatoes. I'm not sure if it's the same, but I suspect it might be. So if I was trying to get a maximum harvest, I'd probably prune a plant to grow as tall as I could reach. I'd prune it to two or three main vines, and then keep the rest of it nice and trim and open. And I'd fertilize on a regular basis. So that's really all I do. I tend to get good harvests, anyways. Like you said,
Yes.
there's so many tomatoes. I don't know what to do with them all.
Yeah, when it came to that given moment, I was just giving backfuls of tomatoes left and right. And even with that, I couldn't keep up with it. It was
Right,
a lot. And so I'm trying to get to that point again to like donate them to like my church, etc. Um, because it's nice when you're able to share your harvest with other
hmm,
people and then to see how gardening is different from buying veggies at the store. It's completely
right.
different. The feeling's completely different as well. So, moving on to our last and final question for this week's episode. Is there any tips or advice you could give to any beginner gardeners out there, whether it be for tomatoes, peppers, anything in general? What are some tips and advice you could give to beginner gardeners who want to jump into growing their own food?
Um, wow, that's a tough question because gardening is so encompassing. You could talk about uh, soil management, where to place your garden in your yard, or whether you're going to container garden on your porch. Um, just do it is the thing I would say. Just go for it and learn as you go and make corrections as you learn. Oops, I put my garden in the wrong place. That's what I had to do. I had to move my garden. My raised beds were the wrong side of my yard, and I had some Bradford pear trees. Never buy a Bradford pear tree, but I had some, and they were growing so huge that I couldn't grow anything in my garden because it was in the shade. So 10 years ago, I moved my garden. So don't be afraid to correct your mistakes like that, and expect to make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I tried to grow lettuce in the summer when I was a kid, and well, that was a mistake. It doesn't work here. Um, Learn about soil and what kind of soil you have if you're going to grow in the ground, and then you can still grow in your ground if you have bad soil. If you start out with a raised bed on top of that soil, because as you amend that raised bed over the years, it'll work its way down into your native soil and amend that. The earthworms will help bring that up. At this point, my raised beds are pretty much in ground beds with a border around them now. So um, I'm trying to find more advice. I mean, just go for it. Read some books. That's the thing. Well, today we watch YouTube, but um, get educated. I mean, there's no excuse for us as gardeners not to be educated about gardening when there's YouTube out there with all these wonderful channels out there. You had some of my favorite gardeners on your episode. You had Kay Cottrell, you had Gardner Scott, and I know both of them. And Kay is a perfect example of learning as you go. I mean, she didn't know how to homestead. She didn't know how to garden in a big. She didn't know how to garden in pots and in a little front yard when she was in California. But when she came to Tennessee, she said, "Okay, I have to learn this stuff."
Mm-hmm.
And Gardner Scott, he's an excellent resource. The dude is smart. Um, so get educated about how to grow, because gardening is not as simple as just putting a seed in the soil and watering it once. There's things to know. Like, you can get so many cucumbers um, if you let them sprawl on the ground, you'll have cucumbers coming out your ears. But if you trellis them,
Mm-hmm.
you'll still have a lot of cucumbers, but you'll have a nice tidy garden, and you won't get powdery mildew as soon. You won't get all these diseases. Um, so a new gardener who's just coming into it, um, do the simple thing. Start with the starts you buy at the store. Go buy a few plants at the store, and be sure you look at them and look under their leaves and make sure you're not bringing home pests with you. But Go do that. Get you some garden soil, some good garden soil, and build a little raised bed. I actually started raised bed gardening with the square foot method, and learned how to learn how to follow that plan. But I soon found that I'm not a very method driven gardener. I didn't like the square foot method. It was too intense. So I just suggest growing a few plants in a small raised bed to get started. I wish I could come up with more, but I've been so far gone from being a new gardener, I've forgotten most of the struggles I had then.
Yeah, I definitely have to agree with you because lots of beginner gardeners, or when I started, you have so many things that you want to do that you don't know where to start. And
Hmm.
so, like you say, just do it. Just see something you may like, oh, I like that tomato plant, grab it, plant it, see how
Hmm.
it works in your area, experiment. Because gardening is an entire experiment because you're trying to see what works best for you.
Hmm.
And like you mentioned with Kay, she I started seeing her videos when she was still in Cali. And when she moved over to Tennessee, it was like a completely new world for her. She
Yeah.
did not know where to start, but she's now learning lots of stuff and she's doing many stuff now.
Hmm.
Not to mention how even when she started her garden in California, she didn't know either what to start with. And so to see how she started from a small urban garden to now a homestead, it's amazing. And that's where I've been working with, because I do agroforestry, which is just kind of plant a whole bunch of fruit trees in the same area
Hmm.
and let them grow. Um, as you can see by like the background, that's the nursery. And so that's what we ideally do. You have to see where you fit in. Like last week's episode with Aitza, we were talking all about it. We were talking about just see where you fit in the garden industry. Like if you don't see, like I started off in the flower industry, I only did pure ornamentals, but then I switched over to growing your own food. You have to see where you fit and don't be afraid to change anything,
Hmm.
because gardening is never done. You will
Right.
always be evolving, whether it be changing a raised bed to another location, whether it be transplanting something, it's going to be changing in general. And if you kill a plant, that does not mean you have a black thumb. Even
Right.
the professional gardeners out there have killed and still are killing thousands of plants because they're experimenting. That's something I always tell someone, because
Yeah.
whenever a friend of mine is like, I have a black thumb, I killed a plant, I'm like, did you try again? Because it's always like a trial and error. Not all plants are going to do the best. Some are going to do perfect. Some are going to do meh. Some of them are going to not do well at all. So it's always about trial and error and picking out the ones you know that are the best in your area and leave some room for experimenting, because
Mhm.
who doesn't like a new variety here and then? That's what I like to do as well here, since that's something we like to do in general. Just try new things.
Yeah. And if you're a new gardener and you do have a plant that dies, then you have an opportunity to learn, because then you can go back and start the process of elimination. Okay, I watered enough, I fertilized, but the plant still died. What's the cause of it? Oh, well, look at my soil. It's largely sand. Well, then you planted in the wrong place, right? So you can learn those things as you go. And yeah, I kill enough plants to fill my compost bin.
And hey, you can use the dead plants as another thing like compost. Something we do here is chop and drop. If there's something that's done, you chop it and you just drop it, and it'll naturally decompose, and it's a natural fertilizer for your garden.
Hmm.
It's something that we all tend to see. So that is all the questions I have about tips and tricks for tomatoes. We covered from temperature, best way to grow them, fertilizing, sunlight, watering, everything you need to learn about tips and tricks on growing tomatoes. And of course, there is the entire list of videos that our moderator Jay has left in the comment section for you guys to go ahead and go through and check out from Scott's video. So thank you so much, Scott, for joining with us on episode number 8. We will be here next week, same day, same time, with a new guest and with a completely new topic to discuss about, since spring is coming up. Lots of people are starting their gardens and there's lots of topics to discuss about. So make sure you join us next week on Growing Generations podcast. Thank you so much, Scott, for joining with us this week.
Thanks for having me.
So we'll go ahead and see you all later. Bye, everyone.